Hey, Michael with X-Force PC. What I'm going to try to do today is what I call a Bob Ross. If you remember, there was a guy named Bob Ross on TV that used to do a painting, and he would do it all in one take. And so essentially that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to put together a platinum system and talk about the components and why we choose them, and I'm going to see if I can do it all in one take. Now, first of all, we're currently building our platinum system based on a full ATX motherboard, but I plan to transition to a micro-ATX motherboard. And if you're wondering what that means, essentially this is the current board over here, and then this is the micro-ATX sized board over on the right here. Sorry, I'm fumbling around here a bit. And you can see, we lose one PCI Express X16 slot, and we lose one X4 slot. But nowadays these slots really are not that valuable, and especially for X-Plane, you're not doing multi-GPU and things like that. So I prefer to use a micro ATX layout, and that way we can put it in a little bit smaller case. It's not a small case, smaller, and that allows it to be not so huge and unwieldy. Now, this is currently an ASRock board, but we typically use Gigabyte, but Gigabyte doesn't have a micro ATX motherboard right now that I'm really a big fan of. So that's why we're using this board, at least as of right now. So things we look for in a motherboard, or things that are good about this motherboard, is we have an 8-pin power connection. It's a Z370 chipset, meaning it is kind of the enthusiast chipset that allows for overclocking if you so choose, and has two front USB 3.0s, though we'll only be using one of those. Two M.2 slots, that's for the SSD, which we'll be installing in just a moment. So it's kind of handy to have two of those. And then really, some of the other stuff is just basic I/O, but that's some of the good things. And then also, and this is what the Gigabyte board doesn't have, is it has multiple fan headers on the motherboard. I like to connect the fans to the motherboard, and that way the motherboard can speed up and slow down the fans as needed, rather than the fans just running full blast all the time or some set speed all of the time. So the first thing I'm going to do is install the processor. We're going with an 8600K here, i5. So we usually run this at 4.5 gigahertz. I think the normal base clock on this is 3.6 if I remember correctly. And there's some really fine pins underneath this chip in this socket that can be damaged very, very easily. In fact, I have done it just recently. In the last 6 months, I've done it at least once. And what I was doing, pretend this is the chip, I was getting ready to put the chip in, and it slipped out of my hand, and the corner fell and hit the socket, bent the pins, and there was no way to fix it. And so that's why there's this cover on there to sort of protect that. The next thing I'm going to do is, I've already assembled this piece, but we have to install the bracket to hold the tower cooler on. And so it has to go through some holes here. And then these screws are kind of sticking up. And I am using this driver. It is a non-impact driver. I have various torque settings that I like to use. For instance, when I install this cooler, I do it on torque setting number 5. I don't know if that's 5 foot-pounds or 5 what, but 5 is what I found to be the appropriate torque setting for this. When you hear that clicking at the end, that's just the torque kicking in. That's not me stripping the nut or anything like that. It just kind of catches, and I'll turn it all the way down to minimum. It just makes that noise whenever the clutch is kicking in. Alright, so we've got the mounting mechanism for the tower cooler in. You can see that's going to go right on there. We're not going to put that in yet because it would kind of get in our way. Next thing we're going to do is put in this SSD. You may not be familiar with this type of SSD. The original SSDs that came out were 3.5 inch. They looked like a laptop hard drive, but now we use M.2. and that's what this type of slot is. And I mentioned earlier there's a second one here if you decided down the road you wanted to add a second M.2 slot, or excuse me, M.2 SSD. And there's just one screw that kind of holds that in. I'm not going to put the RAM in yet. We do have some DDR4 3000 RAM here. The RAM, if I put it in, it's going to interfere with me trying to install the cooler. So that's all I really install ahead of time before putting the motherboard into the case. Let's talk about the case. It's a Fractal Design Define Mini C is what type of case this is. It's a really nice case. It's got a filter in the front that's removable. It's got some nice controls on top, a really nice feeling power button. It's got, of course, headphone, microphone, reset, and front USB 3.0. It also has this plastic thing that can be removed, and you can put a water cooler in the top. So if we build this system with an i7, we put a water cooler radiator up here that blows the air straight out of the top. But we're using an i5 here. We don't need water cooling, and so we're going to use an air cooler for that. Obviously, there's a windowed side panel here. I usually go ahead and peel off the inside protective film, and I leave the outside film on and allow the customer to remove that. Throw that away, and then let me take the other side off. It does have some anti-noise lining here. It's rather thin. I don't know how much protection it gives you from noise, but it is here. It's nice to have, and so that's a good thing. Now, oh yeah, there's also this little mesh cover. So if you wanted to take the plastic cover off the top, you could put this mesh on there, but I usually just kind of pitch that thing because it just doesn't seem necessary. We've got a fan in the front and a fan in the rear. We have the ability to add another fan here if we think it's necessary, and you can see the filter here, filter mesh, and as I mentioned earlier, we can put a water cooler up in the top. Now I happen to know that when I build this system, you see the fan wire is coming off over here on this side. I want it to come off over here for better cable management. So what I do, turn my torque up a bit, is I take this fan out and I rotate it 90 degrees so that the wire is coming off where I want it to come off as I drop a couple of the screws. So I've rotated it 90 degrees so that the fan wire is coming off where I want it. And pick up a couple of these screws I dropped. Because when you build a system, you want to run the cabling in a well thought out manner. Anybody can go straight from point A to point B, but these cases that we buy are nice cases, and they're designed for you to run the power cabling and other cabling behind the motherboard so that it does, and keeps this area very open for airflow, and it just looks nicer when you do it that way. So the next thing I need to do is turn this thing around, and we've got all the front panel connections here. And one thing I don't particularly care for on this, and this is a minor complaint on this particular case, is the front panel wires are all just sort of individual little wires instead of bundled together. So what I typically do, I take these cable ties that come with the motherboard and I use them to bundle up these front panel wires so they're kind of in a nice little cable bundle here. Take me just a moment to do that. And this video isn't intended for someone who's in a hurry. This is going to be a long one, so you need to be patient if you're watching this video, or plan to watch it at a later time. You see I have those kind of bundled up now together, and then I just trim off this excess here. Pitch that. We also have a fan wire here, and we're going to potentially plug that into the motherboard, so I'm just going to kind of loosen that up, leave it over to the side. Now the motherboard doesn't just sit flat in the bottom of the case. You have these standoffs, and what the standoffs do is it keeps the motherboard from grounding out on the case. And if you install these incorrectly, well, that will happen. So you have to know where these things go, or at least test fit your motherboard and make sure that these are in the right place. I've done this once or twice, so pretty much have it memorized where these need to go. Oops. And they're hard to, because of the paint, they're kind of hard to thread in with your hand. So there's this little, I don't know, nut thing that's got a screwdriver thing on one side, and it fits these standoffs, so I can go back now and just kind of run those in. And I have my torque set where I want it, because you want these nice and tight, but you don't want to strip them. Alright, so with that in, we put in the I/O plate that goes in the back. That's where all the ports for the motherboard kind of stick out of the back of the case. And then we can go ahead and stick the motherboard in. And then we're going to screw it down. Get my torque where I want it. And I grabbed the wrong screws. That's what happens when you do a Bob Ross. There's two types of screws that typically come with computers. There's what I call coarse thread and fine thread, and I picked up fine thread screws, and this actually calls for the coarse thread. Fine thread screws are typically used for DVD drives. For these motherboard standoffs, it can vary. It could be the coarse or it could be the fine thread. It varies from case to case. So we've got the motherboard installed now, believe it or not. Next I'm going to put the power supply in. So we typically sort of spec this with a 700 watt, and that's the minimum wattage. We actually have a 750 here, and we use EVGA. We use some Thermaltake, we use some Corsair, it's all the ones I can think. Oh, we use some Seasonic, some Cooler Master. So the brand of the power supply could vary. And you noticed I know this is probably noisy, but not much I can do about that. You notice I took a little plate off of the back. That allows me to get this power supply in. Not all cases work that way. This one does, though. And then this plate you put onto the back of the power supply, and then you screw that plate to the back of the case. So I'm going to do that real fast. I'm trying to be efficient to keep this video as short as we can, realistically, while still doing a good job on this system. Sometimes you have to loosen these up just a bit so that all of the screws will fit in just right, and then you tighten them all up at the end. That's usually what I do. Alright, so then set my torque. So now the plate is attached to the power supply, and then these two screws will attach the plate to the back of the computer. Now the power supply is in. Now we don't use all of the cables from the power supply. We use maybe half of them because they give you a lot of extra cables. This is the one for the motherboard, the CPU power, auxiliary power. So I just stick that through up top, and that'll come out right where it needs to plug in. Then we have the main motherboard power. I think this is a 24 pin if I remember correctly. Kind of stick that through right where it's going to plug in. Then we have the dedicated graphics card power, and we stick that through again right about where it's going to plug in. Alright, and then we have this is the front panel audio. So it gives the, you know, the sound, sends the headphone and microphone sound up to the front of the computer. I'll go ahead and poke that through. Then we've got a fan here. I'm going to wait on that. This is the front panel wiring. So power button, reset button, hard drive LED, power LED. I'm going to go ahead and stick that through right where it plugs in. And then the same for the USB 3. I think it might need to go like that. And so we'll turn this over and have a look. Alright, so these cables are obviously a little longer than they have to be. And I'm going to go ahead and plug in the motherboard power here where it goes. Kind of bend that wire down so it goes right into that hole. This is our auxiliary power for the video card, which we're going to install later. This is the CPU power. So this feeds power directly to the processor, and that allows for steady power delivery as well as the ability to do reliable overclocking. Now some of this stuff that we plug in doesn't actually lock in place and could come loose in shipping. So I will put just the tiniest little bit of super glue, and this is the front USB 3.0, just the tiniest little bit to sort of hold it. I'm even going to take a little bit of that off. Just enough to hold it, but not so much that if it ever needs to be unplugged, it can't be. But it won't come undone in shipping with that little dab of super glue. The same for the rear fan here. I just put the tiniest little bit of super glue on there that I can, just to give a little bit of a hold, but not to make it permanent. And actually we're going to run it through this grommet. No, I take that back. We're going to put it right here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to shove the excess wire through the grommet, and we'll wire manage that later when we're around back again. So again, we take a lot of care when we build these systems. Everything's, you know, sort of well thought out, how the wires are run, how they're plugged in and everything. I'm currently connecting the front, you may not be able to see it that well, but the front connections for power switch, reset switch, power LED, hard drive LED. They're kind of little wires. And you have to get your positive and negative correct on the lights. The reset switch and the power switch, it doesn't matter because all that does is short the two pins to do a reset or a power on. Though they do label them positive and negative, I'm not really sure why. Because this doesn't really mean anything. So I'm going to take out some of these expansion covers back here. This allows us to install our graphics card as well as our wireless AC card and some USB 2.0 ports. So this particular configuration, you would only end up with one USB 2.0 port. But sometimes we found that certain devices like the Cytec panels really don't want to work on a USB 3.0 connection, even though they should, even though it should be backwards compatible. So we have this little device here that we install, and that gives you two more USB 2.0s in the back. Before I install that, I am going to plug in our front panel audio to the motherboard that we poked through earlier. Just make sure I got that right. Now I do. Alright, then we're going to put in our extra two USB ports. And and those plug into the USB 2.0 header down here at the bottom. There's 2 of those, and each one of those can support 2 USB ports. And we have our Wi-Fi card here, wireless AC card, and so we can go ahead and stick that in. That goes into one of the short slots, which is an X4 slot. The larger slots are known as X16 slots, and that refers to the speed of those slots. And then we have 2 antennas that go in the back for this wireless card. So I'll go ahead and put those in. Alright, what's next? I think we'll do the CPU next. The cooler, I should say. So here we have our tower cooler, which sits on the CPU like that. We have these copper heat pipes here which take the heat away. And they always say just put a pea-size dot there in the middle. Well, I don't know. I like to make sure there's at least a little bit on all these heat pipes. So I just kind of dab it along each pipe, and then I put a little extra right in the middle. So you might wonder what's this for. This is called thermal paste, and if you looked at this under the microscope and you looked at the processor under the microscope, it's not a perfectly smooth surface, and so this fills in all of the little scratches and imperfections and makes a real tight seal with the processor so that the heat can be transferred effectively into this tower cooler. And it really is necessary. It's not a, you know, I'm just thinking about doing this or whatever. It's something you have to do. The heat transfer without thermal paste is absolutely terrible. So it's something you absolutely have to do. And I just kind of tighten each of these a little bit at a time. Kind of get a even fit, because you want this thing sitting flat on that processor. You don't want it sort of off kilter and with a little bit of pocket of air in there, and then you won't have good heat transfer. Next I'm going to put on the fan. So this fan blows this way and it blows straight into this fan, which blows the air out of the back of the case. So I'm just going to clip that on, and then I'm going to take the fan wire and just kind of route it around the motherboard power thing to make sure that that doesn't get caught up in our fan. Now I'm going to plug it in, and it sort of locks when you plug it in. It doesn't want to come out, so I don't really need to put a little dab of super glue there. I usually do not. Next we're going to stick in our 2 8-gig sticks of DDR4 3000 RAM. Usually put the RAM in pairs because it reads and writes from both sticks of memory at the same time to theoretically give you enhanced performance. The reason I say theoretically is, yes, it does give you better performance, but it's kind of minor. It doesn't make a tremendous difference, but every little bit counts. And if you keep adding these little things that give you a little bit more performance, eventually it kind of adds up to be a pretty big number. You noticed I grabbed the graphics card here and I'm putting it into the number 1 X16 slot, and we're going to secure that and make sure that the ports in the back are not obstructed in any way. And then I'm going to plug in the dedicated power connection for the graphics card, because these graphics cards cannot even come close to getting the necessary power that they need to perform like they need to out of the slot on the motherboard. It just can't put out that much power, not even remotely close. So pretty much every graphics card that's of any measurable, decent performance is going to have an auxiliary power connection, and sometimes, the really high-end ones will even have 2. So I'm just kind of securing this power cable down so we don't have to worry about it getting caught up in anything like the fan or anything like that. Then I'm going to pull a little of the excess back here towards me. secure that other end. I know you probably can't see what I'm doing at this point, but just bear with me. I'm going to cut this excess off here. Alright, so that's pretty much everything on the top side. Then we just go around back and do our due diligence on the back. Usually I do this with it standing up, but I'm going to lie it flat here so that it's easier to see. One thing this Fractal Design case has is kind of neat is this little panel, which I don't need to remove here. I'm just doing it because I'm showing you. So if you forget to put on, or I forget to put on the plate on the back for mounting the tower cooler, you still have access to that without having to take the whole motherboard back out again. So that's nice. You can see this is the excess wire from the rear powered fan. And so I'm just going to kind of bundle it up here and just tie it off so it isn't just wandering around back here. Looks like, you know, make it look like we care how this is being done. Alright, and then this is the auxiliary power for the processor. And so we want to tie that down using these little tie down areas here. Again, just so it's not wandering around all over and looking messy. We want to make a nice presentation, and you know, it's just better to be neat about things. We still have this fan to deal with. This is the front fan. Let me see where to stick that through. We're going to hook that in up top here. So I'm just going to kind of poke that through there, and we'll worry about that in a minute. Alright, continuing on, this is the front panel audio here, if you're wondering what that is. This is the front panel power switch, reset switch, and all that. And we want to just sort of try to be neat with these things. So just going to tie these down. And we want to make sure that they're not being tugged on because we don't want to pull them out of where they're plugged in. The other thing I want to do here is use these Velcro straps to hold the main motherboard power down, and even the power cable for the GPU. So I just pull back the Velcro and sort of reattach it there, so that that's as neat as it can be. And you know, we're running up this kind of depression or channel here, which is where it's meant to go. The other thing we have to do while we're back here is we have to do something with these extra cables that came with the power supply. So I sort of neatly gather those up. You probably can't see what I'm doing here, but I'll show you in a minute. Neatly gather these up, sort of like so. And then I secure them with a cable tie, which I foolishly don't have in my hand. And these are cables that would be used later on if you decided to add a hard drive or a second graphics card or whatever. They give you more cables than you actually need. So we just bundle those up, and then we kind of push those up in here. You can see there's a spot to add 2 hard drives here if you wanted to in the future, so that's what those would be used for. The one thing we haven't done is done something with this fan, the front fan. So we need to attach that to the motherboard. And there's a spot right up here in the front. You probably can't see it all that well, but I'm going to do my thing where I do like a little tiny bit of super glue, just the tiniest little bit. And then plug that in. Where did it go? No, my mistake. It's going to go right down here. My eyes aren't what they used to be. So we got that plugged in, and so we just have to be neat with that now. So it's just kind of hanging out here. So I'll sort of gather that up and just take the excess and cable tie that. That should be it. Let's have a look. So we double check our work here. So you see everything's very neat. There's as little cabling as possible. I'm going to tie down this, or kind of bundle up this CPU cooler wire so it's a little neater looking. So there's a whole computer built in, I don't know, a relatively short amount of time. So we've got our video card, we got our processor underneath this tower cooler, we've got two 16 gig sticks of RAM, our 750 watt power supply, even have a wireless card, and we added two extra USB 2.0 ports to the back, and we have our M.2 SSD, which you can't see, which is going to be, you know, right down here on the motherboard. So there's your Bob Ross computer build of a Platinum system based on a micro-ATX platform.